I'm Crystal Dilworth, Polycrystal HD, here for Raw Science. On the eve of my PhD thesis defense, here to talk about technologies that are going to change the way that we experience our world. I have two illustrious guests here with me. One is Philip Lowe, who's the inventor of the iBrain and founder and CEO of the company Neurovigil. Our other guest is Elon Musk, who really needs no introduction, but he's also at the helm of the private space company SpaceX. So thank you so much for joining me, guys.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So Philip, I want to know a little bit about this iBrain, and I understand that there's a new version.
Yeah, so, well, the iBrain is the world's first mobile brain monitor, in the sense that it's, we've introduced it as a little startup 4 years ago. The company Hoffmann La Roche has used it to do outpatient clinical trials. Since then, we've used it with a number of other pharmaceutical companies. And what we've done is we've collected data from individuals who are sleeping. We've produced maps of brain activity to see how they react to pathologies and to particular compounds. The devices have become smaller and smaller and smaller, and this latest version is about the size of a miniature Listerine packet. So it's really tiny. So that's the Listerine. And, and this is iBrain 3. The first one, though, did fit in Tic Tac boxes. So we've gone from, from one level of dental hygiene to another. But this is pretty exciting to us because it means that it is now possible to record neural data not only from a few hundred people or a few thousand people, but literally tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people. And with that, we want to use the power of analytics and big data in order to really see if people are actually diseased before they have symptoms.
So you're looking for a pattern in the brainwaves.
We're looking for patterns, and we're also making sure that new drugs, before they hit the market, are actually clean and safe.
So Elon, you've been very vocal about the possibilities of colonizing other planets, specifically Mars, and
Right.
Your own company is doing a lot of work to get us to the stage where we're able to do that. Do you think that starting a colony on Mars would kind of be a chance to start over and maybe do a little bit better? Or do you think it's a chance to copy what nature on Earth has already created for us?
Yeah, I think it's quite likely that we'd want to bioengineer new organisms that are better suited to living on Mars. I mean, humanity's kind of done that over time by sort of selective breeding. Cows didn't evolve in the wild,
Right.
But that's a very slow process, requires hundreds of generations, whereas I think with actual bioengineering you could make that happen a lot faster, maybe with more precision. Ideally, long-term, although this is a tricky subject, you'd want to write genetics.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning you'd want to create synthetic organisms.
Completely synthetic organisms?
Not necessarily completely, but start with some base and then modify stuff.
In the interest of colonization of other planets, are you relying on the research of government-funded space programs on the effects of being in space for long periods of time, or does SpaceX have any interest in doing its own research?
Well, I think the verdict is in with respect to long-term existence in space, really mostly about zero G. In my opinion, it is certainly
defining long-term too.
Well, certainly more than enough to get to Mars.
Okay.
Mars is, if you have a low energy trajectory, like minimum energy trajectory, it's about 6 months. I think that can be compressed down to about 3 months, and it gets exponentially harder as you go lower than that. Three to four. I mean, and it's important to actually be at that level because then you can send your spaceship to Mars and bring it back on the same orbital synchronization. So Earth and Mars sync up every 2 years, and then they're only kind of in sync for about 6 months. So and then they're really too far apart. So you've got to be able to go there and back in one go, and that's important for making the cost of traveling to Mars an affordable amount. Because you think of what's the key thing to establish a colony on Mars? It's the cost per unit mass to the surface of Mars, or the cost per person as well. At a certain level, if it's too high, obviously there won't be such a thing. But once it gets to a certain level, it will the it's like a reaction. The activation energy is sort of like the economic activation energy of a Martian colony. I mean, right now it's like, I don't know. If the last NASA estimate was $500 billion, and that was during Bush the First. So I would imagine today's estimate is $1 trillion. Now we're not going to go spend $1 trillion on sending like 4 people to Mars. Mm-hmm. So right now the cost of going to Mars is beyond what can be afforded. So that's why there's like no one's going to Mars. But ultimately, in order to establish a colony, I think you've got to get the cost down to maybe $500,000 or less per person to go. And there's got to be an intersection of sets of people that can afford to go and people that want to go.
What was the moment that you decided that this was your mission, and how did you make that decision to investigate? So Philip, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So, well, the thing is, I'm an accidental entrepreneur, and before that I was an accidental neuroscientist. And before that I was a mathematician. And then it wasn't until Stephen Hawking asked me to help him with his ALS that I became really involved in trying to access consciousness in humans. I think the previous work that I had done on consciousness in animals was more to sort of show some of the basic similarities in terms of the neurobiology. But it's very interesting how these things work. I think when you're passionate, you really don't know why you do things. Because if you did, you may actually have some sort of control over them. In my case, when I was 10 years old, my father was incarcerated. He had threatened someone with a gun. In Switzerland, it's a very bad idea to threaten a banker with a gun. Mm-hmm. And he had a drug in his system, a sleep drug, which was found then later on to create quite a few side effects, including extreme violence. So he was sent to jail. I remember going to see him then, and his case was reopened. He was the first person to be pardoned by the cantonal parliament in Geneva unanimously. And at the time, I thought, he got away with it. He had a very good attorney, and I was trying to be sort of clinical about the whole thing. Ironically, 15 years later, I'm doing a PhD on sleep. I challenged one of my professors. I said, what if I used this particular drug, for example, in mice, just to see his reaction? He said, Philip, you can't use this. It makes people psychotic and aggressive. So once I had heard this 15 years later, I thought, okay, this is perhaps my father was not or was not guilty at all. So it was interesting. My first reaction was to pick up the phone and apologize 15 years later to my father that, I had doubted his innocence.
I thought you were just bullshitting.
Exactly. So it was interesting. And now, of course, we're helping some pharmaceutical companies come up with cleaner drugs. That's exactly what we do. So
it's really a very personal motivation.
I guess it is, but I didn't realize that it was until I actually had begun doing it.
Thank you for sharing that. So I guess I'll ask you the same question, Elon. Like, what drives you? Like, when did you realize that this work was important, and kind of what's your personal motivation behind it?
Yeah, it's just when I was in college. I mean, I try to think, well, what are the things that are most going to affect the future of humanity, and I wanted to be involved in at least some of those things. I didn't expect to be involved in all of them, but mostly I just wanted to be involved in things that I thought would matter to the future, and to be able to look back and say, okay, I did something useful there.
Did you have specific role models that were influential in the decisions that you made, or was it just some type of, an internal understanding that this is what you needed to do?
I wouldn't say there was like it wasn't any one particular role model. I mean, there's certainly many people that I admire in history. Tesla obviously being one of them. Yes. I think it stems because I had this like existential crisis when I was a kid, and tried to figure out what's it all about, and none of the books I read seemed to actually have a good answer. So I read all the religious texts, and I read a bunch of philosophy books, and they're all quite depressing, particularly the Germans. Actually, when I read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I thought, okay, this is a pretty good one. Just to sort of try to gain greater enlightenment over time. That seems like a good goal. Because we don't really know what the meaning of life is, or even really what the right questions are to ask. But if we can improve our understanding of the universe, then eventually we can figure out what the right question to ask is. if it's not meaning of life, it's something, Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you, Elon and Philip, for joining me here and sharing your thoughts about consciousness and enlightenment and technology and where we're going. I've really appreciated it, so thank you so much. And hopefully we'll have a lot of other very interesting conversations about technology and the future of humanity.